Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. It is June 6th, Tuesday morning for our Small Business Boot Camp. I'm Robert Theobald, Small Business Ombudsman and Vice President of Small Business Services here at the Arizona Commerce Authority. We're glad to have you with us today. And one thing I'd like to do as we start is please post up in the chat where you are tuning in from. If you are where you're in the state, or if you're from out of the state or out of the country, let us know where you're tuning in from for today's session. And as we go through the opening slides that I have, that many of you have seen, some of you may not, so we'll jump into those. For those that are new, we like to start by recognizing all of our community partners. We could not do these webinars without their time, their effort, and their expertise. Also, the Small Business Boot Camp is designed to help small businesses prepare, plan, and grow through our webinars and our workshops. We utilize local business leaders and subject matter experts to bring you the most current and valuable content to help you with small business. Another great part of the Small Business Boot Camp is our small business content library. One of the great things is from the beginning of the boot camp, we have recorded nearly every session. There's a few that we couldn't record due to licensing agreements, but we have over 250 recorded webinars and workshops that you can go onto the content library and access and review at any time. There's no cost. You can also download the slide decks that our presenters use. So it is an amazing resource that is available to you to access when needed. Additionally, the ACA has a number of programs to help support small business. As you see here on the screen, we have the Career Readiness Credential, the Arizona Innovation Challenge, Arizona MEP, which is Manufacturing Extension Partnership, our Arizona State Trade Expansion Program, AC STEP, Arizona at Work, and then our small business services that I oversee. You can go to ACA programs. There's a website there on the page, and we'll post that in the chat as well. And you can find all the different programs that the ACA has for small businesses and large businesses alike. Another great tool that you'll find on our website is the Small Business Checklist. And this is an online interactive resource that helps entrepreneurs identify the commonly requested licensing, registration, and compliance needs at the local, state, and federal levels. You can also find a lot of other great information on the checklist. There is a very deep amount of information on there, but to also simplify some of it, we have Sally, our state and local licensing information virtual assistant, that you can go on and find some simpler versions of the deep responses. But if you really need the deep content with all the links and access, then go through the checklist program, and you can find a ton of information to help you as you're starting your business and growing your business as well. So with that, I want to share an update, and this is a really important update. I'm glad all of you are here to hear it. I'm sharing it because I've seen a lot of messages, and I've received a lot directly from the IRS, from our local IRS representative that works and supports small business. And the IRS is very concerned about employee retention credit scams. And I'm sure you've all heard on the radio, on lots of different radio stations, businesses claiming to help you get the employee retention credit. And some are promising big money and other stuff. The IRS is wanting to be cautious, be careful on that, because if those businesses help you get the credit and they miscalculate, you as the business owner are responsible for paying back the error. And you've already paid that business that helped you. So there's a lot of money at stake, and a lot of these companies are not being as accurate as they need to be. So the IRS is very concerned. They're sending out a lot of information. We're going to post a link in the chat as well for more information from the IRS, but it's one of those things, please be careful with it. And with that, we're going to look at the upcoming sessions. Next week, we have our cybersecurity and small business. This is with a great Google presenter, Mary Rabago, who's been with us before. And it's going to go through Google's tools to help with cybersecurity for small businesses. And then on June 20th, we're going to have strategic storytelling, the secret to selling yourself, ideas, and business. We're looking forward to that session. And then on June 27th, how to avoid the top 10 legal mistakes that destroy businesses. This is from Brian Burt from Snell and Wilmer. Brian's been with us before, and this is an amazing webinar. We've done this before, but there's always little updates and things Brian shares. I would encourage everyone to be on that one as well. We love all our webinars. They're all great webinars. And we encourage you to be with us for those, but the legal one is amazing. Some of the things that we don't think of that can hurt your business. So please be with us there. And then also on June 20th at 6 p.m., it's not listed here, is our Spanish language webinar. So if you know any business owners that their primary language is Spanish, please invite them to come attend that webinar. It's 100% in Spanish, bringing our experts as well to help support Spanish-speaking businesses throughout the state. With that, we're going to jump into today's session and today's speaker. We have Kristen Carmichael. She's the director of the Lodestar Mediation Training at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at ASU. And so we're excited to have Kristen back with us. She was on with us once before, but it's probably been about 1.5 years, 2 years since the last time. So we're excited to have her back. So Kristen, I'm going to stop sharing and let you take over.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Robert. I appreciate it. And thank you for having me. Welcome, everyone. It is a bit of a mouthful, but yes, we are the Lodestar Dispute Resolution Center at ASU's Law School, and we focus on training alternative dispute resolution skills. So that includes everything from negotiation skills, mediation, arbitration, difficult conversations, communication, and listening skills. So today we're really going to focus on difficult conversations in your business. And so that could be everything from you have a disgruntled customer or client all the way to having a difficult conversation with an employee. Let that be you need to fire someone or you need to set them up on a performance plan or something. It's a conversation that's going to naturally be uncomfortable, and we're going to talk through how that works today. If you have any questions throughout, please feel free to throw them into the chat or the Q&A. I will be able to look at both of them and we'll get started. If you do have any questions, my email as well will be at the end. So if you have additional questions after the presentation, you're welcome to reach out. We always welcome getting any feedback from anyone on any additional information they need. So to get started, just communication in general. So we take communication for granted, and that's because we do it every day. We send text messages, emails, we communicate via newsletters, just having a conversation. And so it just becomes natural, but ultimately communication has many parts, and those parts are going to ultimately dictate whether the conversation goes well or goes poorly. So first we start with, what is the message we intend? The message we intend is the message we have in our head. What are we thinking about that we want to communicate outwardly to someone else? Then we send the message. That could be via text, email, saying it out loud. A lot of times, even that right there, you have to think, okay, you intend a message, but how is your tone? How are you sharing that information? Are you using language that's going to be applicable to somebody else or something that is more what you're used to? I always joke with this part that my brother is a totally different generation, and it feels like he speaks in a totally different language because he uses slang, and I have no idea what any of it means. So that gets to your message sent to your message received. So he says something, I receive the message, but am I actually receiving the message? That could be everything from your email bounces back and it doesn't get sent to you speak different languages. And so you intend something and you say it to the other person, but they don't speak the same language. So they don't actually understand what you're saying. And then ultimately that person understands what they're hearing. So the biggest misstep is message sent to message received, how someone else is receiving the message and then interpreting it. But communication can fall apart anywhere on this scale. And so that's why it's really important to understand that, especially when we're having difficult conversations that are going to be more challenging, it's really important that we prepare for those conversations. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is being prepared rather than just walking in. A lot of times, naturally, people will say, well, I just want to walk in, I just want to get it done, rip the Band-Aid off. Makes sense, but ultimately your conversation and communication is going to be much more successful if you prepare to have that conversation and also know what you're looking for while the conversation is happening. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We currently live in a time where we listen a lot more, not to hear the other person, but to respond. So we're not listening to understand what the other person's thinking, we're listening to respond to them. This is more of a defensive way of hearing people, but it's really natural. We have all this stuff that's flying around. There's social media and the news and the radio's on, and someone is doing something next to you in another cubicle or another office, a lot of different distractions. And so we tend to be stuck in our own heads. The classic example of this is when someone is talking to you and you think in your head, oh, I had something similar happen to me. Ultimately, you're caught in your own narrative of what happened to you rather than listening to the other person. And so it's really imperative, and we'll talk about today, that you're listening to the other person so that you understand what their concerns are rather than how you want to respond. This is particularly important in difficult conversations because what happens is we go in and think, I'm already stressed about what I have to tell the other person. So you're not fully hearing what they're saying because you're sitting in your own stress of having to actually have this conversation in the first place. So a lot of times it becomes more defensive. There's a lot more blaming. It becomes much more challenging than the conversation needs to be because ultimately we're stuck in our own heads. We're not hearing what the other person has to say. So when we're having a difficult conversation, and there's a lot of studies of this, a lot of different psychologists who describe this, as well as a few different books that you can read. One's just called Difficult Conversations. Great. It's a purple cover. Highly recommend it. But they talk about it as a meta process. So there are 3 parts to the conversation, not just one. The first part is emotions. How do you feel about what you're talking about? Usually those are difficult emotions because it's a difficult conversation. So those could be heightened emotions. Let that be anger, sadness, frustration. There's the what conversation. So what actually happened? What are the facts of the situation? And then there's the me conversation, the identity conversation. So how does that relate to me? So thinking of this in a business context, the first context is what is happening. So let's say that you run, for example, a retail business and a customer is upset about a product. Maybe they want to return it or they're upset about something that they purchased. So the what conversation is what actually happened. What are the facts? The fact is that the customer bought this product at your store and now they are upset about it for X reason. So understanding what are the actual facts, the what happened. Then there's the emotions. It's natural as a business owner to become defensive because it's your business, it's your baby, it's your thing that you care most for and that you put a lot of time and effort into. So as the person who is the business owner, it's normal to have the emotions of anger or frustration or potentially just defensiveness, where the other person, the customer, might have the same feelings. They could be sad because they wanted the product to work a different way. They could be angry. We see a lot of heightened anger since COVID, particularly people who are just not at that same level of patience that they used to be. And as business owners, particularly if you work with customers closely, you probably have experienced this. So what emotions are you each feeling? Then there's the identity conversation. So why is that person as a person having a problem with this product? Why you as a business owner are upset about that? So a great example of this is that maybe I'll use myself in my own business, a perfectionist. I hate when clients don't have a good experience, particularly when I think that I could have done it better because I'm a perfectionist. So my emotion might be that I'm frustrated or that I'm sad that they didn't have a good experience, but the me conversation is internally, oh, I feel like I did something wrong personally because I wish that it was perfect. So being able to identify those different things in a conversation. What are the facts? What are the feelings? How does that play into your personal identity? That me process part of the conversation is critically important because that is where we have a difficult conversation issue. We have a problem having the conversation because we're having identity conversations of I did something wrong or I'm right and you're wrong. And so it makes it much more difficult to have the conversation because you're not dividing out the conversation from who you are as a person, which is why they become difficult conversations. So the first thing that we can do, as I said, is prepare. You don't want to just anticipate that it'll go either well or poorly. You want to prepare. And the best way to do that from the beginning is mindfully managing how you're going to do the conversation. So we're going to go through some things that are just kind of tips for how you can prepare internally, but also what you can do in the conversation itself. So first thing is being aware that when you remain calm and open, other people are going to respond the same way. We actually have mirror neurons in our brain, and I'm not going to get into depth into brain science, but a lot of researchers have found that they believe mirror neurons are what help us actually mirror the situations that we're in. As human beings, we naturally want to be liked. We like to be liked. It's not a bad thing. It's actually evolutionarily a good thing. If you're liked, much more likely that you'll be successful, much more likely that you'll survive. And so we have these neurons in our brain that like to mirror other people. So when we go into something more calm and open, if we're focused on how we are, the other person in the conversation is likely to mirror what we are doing. A great example of this is you can find silly situations online of someone who's sitting at a table and they're leaning on their hand. And over an hour at the dinner table, all of a sudden, everyone's leaning like this. So something to keep in mind is how you go into the conversation, much more likely the other person is going to go into it too. If you're like a ball of nervous energy, you're just kind of, anxious, you're twiddling with your fingers and you're tapping your foot, the other person's going to feel your nervous energy and they're going to match it. It's why a lot of people, like if you go into a meeting where your boss, let's say, is going to fire you, if they're nervous, you automatically are nervous and think that something is wrong. And so you interpret not only how they framed it when they invited you to the meeting, what they labeled the meeting name as, any of those pieces, but just feeling their physical energy, you can tell if it's going to be a good or a bad meeting. So it's not saying that you want to hide the fact that it's going to be a bad meeting or a bad, difficult conversation in terms of like firing, or maybe you're not happy with someone's performance. But it is important to realize that when you go in with that nervous energy, the other person's likely going to mirror it back to you. It seems simple, but just breathing. So our brain is actually in multiple different parts. And so the part of our brain at the top is our logical part of our brain. Center is emotion. Way down at the stem of our brain is our lizard part of our brain. That's our natural evolutionary response to flight, freeze, or fight. So what happens is when we're having a difficult conversation, you could be someone who doesn't like conflict, so you just want to run away. Like, I just don't want to deal with it. If I just don't talk about it, it'll go away, right? You could also be the natural where you are more competitive. You're like, no, I'm right. The other person is wrong and I'm going to prove it. Or you could have something in between where you kind of freeze. Like you don't run away, but it's more of what's called an accommodating conflict style, where instead what you're doing is you freeze up and you're kind of stuck there, but you're just going to accommodate what the other person says because you don't want to make the situation worse. So we don't want to end up in that evolutionary part of our brain when we're having these conversations. We want to be in the logical part of our brain as much as possible. As it mentions on the screen, we want to be more in a problem-solving part of our brain. So that's going to be more towards the top or center. We want to stay away from the evolutionary part at the core of our brain. The evolutionary part serves a purpose. It is one of those things where, like, evolutionarily, if you're in the savannah and a lion is coming after you, you don't want to problem solve that. You just want your body to react to save you. The predicament is now we live in a world where we're not standing in a savannah with lions, but a lot of other things are happening. Like it might feel like someone's attacking our business, attacking us personally, attacking what we created. And so we can get into that evolutionary part of our brain. Another great example of this is like if you drive home and you get home from work, but you don't remember how you got there. Like you drove there, you got there from work, you just don't know how you got there. You realistically went towards the center of your brain, and that's where you were stuck. You were thinking about a project, you were in your feelings rather than in the logic part of your brain. So that's where you kind of disappear into that part of where you're thinking. So it's really important that we try and stay towards the logic part of our brain. And how we do that is being mindful, breathing through it, understanding when we feel like we're getting heated. So that could be like, you feel like your chest is tight, your face turns red, kind of the classic cartoon steam coming out of your ears. Instead of going into that fight mode or running away, breathing through it and recognizing what your kind of natural instinct to do when there's conflict or something difficult that you need to confront, breathing through that and understanding how you actually participate in that. Let's see if we have a question. So other thing is going to be feelings. So feelings, a lot of times, a lot of us are really conscious of everybody else's feelings. We want to make everybody feel okay. We don't want to cause negative feelings, which is great. I mean, great in terms of a societal norm of we want everybody to be as happy and productive as possible. But if we go into it trying to control everybody else's feelings and our own, it's not going to be successful. It's too many things to worry about. And you can't worry about the other person the entire time. You're also worrying about being anxious and having this conversation. So making sure you're focusing on you. How can you control how you're going in the meeting calmly, how you usually react to a difficult discussion, and also how you are feeling so that you can help the other person problem solve during this conversation. They're going to come in and they have their own management to do mindfully. You cannot control that other person. So being aware, you cannot control the feelings of someone else. So the best thing that you can do, and it seems contradictory because it's a difficult conversation, talking, right? The best thing that you can do is listen attentively or active listening. I know active listening gets a bad rap because everyone talks about it. It's in a ton of self-help books. If you Googled it, it'd probably be an endless number of pages of perspectives on active listening. But active listening is going to be really important because it allows you to understand where the other person is coming from and have that difficult conversation successfully. So this also comes into preparing for a conversation. So we want to reduce distractions and make sure that we're picking a good place to have the conversation. Firing someone in front of everyone else that you work with, probably not the best place to have that conversation. Same thing, if you have a disgruntled customer who's standing at your desk, ideally, if you can get them to a place where you can kind of step aside with them to have a conversation, it's going to be much more successful than you being in the middle of that room. The reason for that is, one, we're easily distracted. So we're distracted by everything that's going on around us, and so is the other person. So it's really hard to have that conversation when you're distracted by other things. Let that be everything from your computer with it constantly dinging because an email's coming in to you're standing in the middle of a room full of other people. The other thing too is it also helps lower the conflict in the difficult conversation that you're having and shows the other person more respect in that conversation. So imagine how you feel if you're in your place of business and someone comes in and starts yelling at you. You feel defensive, you feel attacked, completely normal. So you don't want that to be the same experience for someone else that you are leading that difficult conversation. So if you go in and you need to have a difficult conversation, asking to talk to someone separately. Can I, talk to your manager separately, or can I set up a time for us to talk? That allows you to reduce distractions and set up and prepare successfully to have that conversation rather than just jumping into it and doing it where it's going to be uncomfortable for everyone. 2 is setting aside bias. This is hard because we're all biased as people, and naturally we have biases towards certain things. This is particularly present when, let's say that you've been working with someone and the difficult conversation is you want to set up a performance plan with them because they haven't been doing the work that you want them to do, or you are talking about potentially removing someone from their position. A bias could be, their natural instinct when you walk into the meeting, likely, and say, hey, you haven't been living up to, the expectations that we had set when you started the job, is for them to get defensive. Well, when they become defensive, our biases and defensiveness automatically jumps up. It's like if someone lightly shoves you, your reaction would be to defend yourself. It's the same thing just with words. So, a natural instinct could be, well, this person's just lazy and that's why they're not performing well. That could be just a bias that you have. But if we don't listen to what the other person has to provide in terms of the information that they are giving us as an explanation, then ultimately we're just living in our bias. We just assume that they're lazy. Now, could they be someone that's not doing the job well? Could they just not have a lot of work ethic? Absolutely. There are people like that. But it could be something else that could be the issue. And so that could be something that you could resolve, but without actually knowing what it is, because your bias is in the way, you have less of a chance to actually problem solve that and find a solution. We already talked about being mindful, but again, being mindful of how you're feeling, how the other person is feeling, and where they are at. A lot of times when people become defensive and reactive, their emotions grow, their logic decreases because they're in a different part of their brain. And so what we want to do is we want to be really mindful of where we're at and identify where they're at so that ultimately we can have a successful conversation. If they're so far into their emotions and they can't even think logically, maybe it's not the time to have a conversation. Maybe we need to just take a breather and come back to it, because otherwise we're just going to spiral rather than coming up with a solution or having a productive conversation. Being curious. I think that we lack curiosity now because there's just so much stuff going on. We have all of these things where we can 1 second be looking at social media, the next second we're watching a new film. Everything is so quick and it's easy to access. It causes distraction, but it also causes us to lack that curiosity. You have to imagine the curiosity of a little kid. Maybe it's a little extreme, but especially when they get to that age where they're like, why is the sky blue? Why do we not get to eat candy for dinner? Why do, unicorns not exist? Being curious about why the other person is bringing that issue to you. This is really present when someone comes to you with a difficult conversation and maybe you're not prepared. You weren't prepared. You didn't know it was going to be a difficult conversation. A customer comes and has a complaint. Being curious about their why. Why are they having this issue? A lot of times we get stuck in this issue of positions. So I have a business. I think that I am great at what I do and I provide a great service. Somebody else, your service was awful. You each have a position. The why, the being curious, is the underlying. Why does that person think that you didn't give a service that was great? It could be just because they're unreasonable. Some people are just unreasonable, but it could be a valid reason of why they have a concern. But if we're just sitting there getting defensive and really talking at them instead of listening to them, we're lacking the curiosity to know the why of what the issue is. Listening in context. This is super important. So many people, when they jump into a difficult conversation, they just jump all over the place. So it becomes like you walked into the conversation to talk about one thing, and then it turns into 12 different things that you were talking about. And by the end of the conversation, you're both just lost and very frustrated, and you have no idea where the conversation went. This is really critical because when you are planning for a difficult conversation, you want to know what are the topics that you want to hit, and then anticipate that the other person might want to talk about other things too. So having kind of an agenda, it doesn't have to be written out. It can be helpful, but in your mind of, these are what I want to talk about. So as an example, I want to talk to this employee about what the expectations are at the job, why they have not met them, and what I think they could do to improve. So you have your 3 points of what you want to talk about, your context for the conversation. Then after that, what happens is they're going to slide in their own issues, but having your own plan, your own context for why you brought the conversation forward allows you to stay focused on what the issues are. They will likely add stuff in there. Some of those topics might fit within your topics as sub issues. So for an example, you bring up what the expectations were and the other person says, well, I didn't know what those expectations were. Okay, maybe they did or they didn't, but that's a subcategory within the same topics. Or you could have somebody total left field. A great example of this is someone who blames other people. So you bring in the context of, I want to talk to this person about their work, and they're like, well, my work isn't great because Susan's work isn't great. And then they go down this trail of like all the awful things that Susan does. Maybe if you kind of step back, if you're curious, maybe if their jobs are directly related, maybe it is an issue. Maybe Susan's work is the one that is impacting the employee's work that you're talking to. So being curious and understanding what they want to talk about, but also not letting them derail the conversation down whatever path they want to go to. That, you know, they don't have the hours they want, that, you know, it's Susan's work that's negative, that X, Y, Z. Yes, we want to be curious, understand what they're talking about, but we want to make sure that we stay in the context of what we're doing. Otherwise, what'll happen is we get lost in the conversation. There's no problem solved. And ultimately, it just leads to more conflict because now you have this employee who's angry about all these other things. Maybe some are solution based. Some of them are just emotions. And so you have nowhere to go with that conversation. So again, being prepared, knowing what is the context of the conversation that you want to have. You're the one preparing for this conversation. And also anticipating that they'll bring other issues in, but those are not issues that you have to cover. You can be curious and address what fits into the context of the conversation, what might be a totally separate conversation. You can always define that. This is what we're talking about in this conversation. I understand you also have these other issues. Those are not relatable to what we're talking about right now, but I'd be happy to set up a time to talk to you about those. Everyone just wants to feel heard. And so by acknowledging the issues that they have, but also providing the context that you want to have in that meeting, you're taking control of the conversation. You are managing what you can handle in that conversation then, and then directing the rest of it to be handled at a different time. The other thing with this is if someone brings a difficult conversation to you and you're not prepared for it, being curious to understand what is the context of the conversation that they want to have. So listening to understand what are their key points. In your difficult conversation, you can prepare key points, but are their key points, their context that they want to talk about. A lot of times what people do is they have a bad day and everything accumulates and then they bring it to you. So maybe they really wanted to talk to you about, maybe it's an employee who's not happy with like the time off schedule and the vacation, but they come to you and they were an offender bender that morning and their kid didn't let them sleep all night and all these other things happen. They were just everyday life. And they bring you this high level issue from their perspective that you're like, okay, we're just talking about vacation time, but they're so wound up from everything that happened that they just kind of word vomit all of the things that they're having an issue with, but only one is something you can fix: vacation time. So being curious, listening, and then picking out, okay, so I understand it sounds like you had a really challenging day, but what you came to me to talk about is vacation time, right? So essentially understanding what their agenda is, so you also know what context you're talking in. The last one is nonverbal cues. We talked about this with being mindful, but you can feel the tension in a room when someone is uncomfortable about talking about something, or you can feel the anger that is radiating off of someone. Paying attention to those things so that you know what you're walking into. You would never see like someone angrily coming into your business and, you know, they're fuming, they're turning red, and you're like, oh, this is a happy customer. That's not the case. So really being attuned to those nonverbal cues. That's important too when, again, for you, when you're going into a conversation, mirroring what you want the other person to react as. Doesn't mean they're going to. If you go in calmly and tell someone you're firing them, are they realistically going to stay calm? Probably not, but they have a more likely chance of being lower conflict, having a more successful conversation if you are displaying those calm nonverbal cues. Second part of listening is acknowledging. Yes, there are many parts of listening. So first, what we did was we were curious, we got the information. We want to acknowledge that they're talking because everyone wants to have that feeling like they are being heard. If you have a conversation with someone who's a really good listener, I do this for work, and I'll say that not everyone's a great listener. I'm not always a great listener, but someone who truly they're, making eye contact, they're listening to you, they're giving you nonverbal cues like nodding, that they understand, they are being present in the conversation. It feels really good. It feels really good to be listened to and actually understood. So we want to make sure that we're not, especially during difficult conversations, a lot of people tend to avoid eye contact, or they're fidgeting, or they're looking at their hands and they can't look at the person that they're talking to. They're trying to distance themselves as much as possible for those that are particularly uncomfortable with difficult conversations or conflict, which is a totally normal conflict style. They tend to physically move back, like they'll move their body away from you because they're so uncomfortable with it. So understanding, one, what is your feeling when it comes to this conversation? Are you wanting to pull back? Are you uncomfortable? Do you not feel like you can have an open conversation with the other person and look them in the eye? And being acknowledging of that internally. But second, looking at that when you're actually talking to the other person. If you can have a difficult conversation, look at the other person in the eye when you're talking to them about it, listen to them and make them feel heard, and even be empathetic. That could be like leaning in when you're providing the information so that they feel like you're more connected, maybe touching their hand or their arm as comfort, something that you'll recognize as something that will provide reassurance to them. That can go so far. And it's not even something that you have to say. It's just how your body is reacting. Instead of someone who's like closed off, they're, looking away, they're pulling back. Those things are not going to make anybody feel comfortable. And they're ultimately going to make the conversation even more difficult. So we want to make sure that we're giving the full attention to the person that we're talking to. That comes back to that no distractions, and making them feel as comfortable as possible when we're having that conversation. Now, a lot of people don't go into it that way. That's why we feel like it's uncomfortable. So someone comes at us, again, really angry, really heated. I don't like this. I don't like that. This didn't work. It throws you off. You can watch people physically step back because the other person is not being conscious of how their body language is affecting you and how their nonverbal cues are affecting you. So again, you can be as conscious of yourself as physically possible. When someone else is coming at you, they're going to have their own nonverbals that you cannot control, but you can at least be conscious of how they impact you personally rather than allowing it to overcome you. Alrighty, lastly is listening, inviting. When we have difficult conversations, a lot of times we want to, as I said, just get in and rip the Band-Aid off. Just get out of it as fast as physically possible. Let's just move on. We don't want to have to talk about it. We don't want to have to do it anymore. That's a normal reaction, but it actually, research will actually show that that will just make the conversation last longer or the issue last longer. So we want to be conscious that everybody's a human being. We would want to be treated with respect, just like we want somebody else to be treated with respect. So first, what we want to do is when we're listening to someone while we're having this conversation is ask questions. It's so hard because if someone comes at you with this didn't work and that didn't work and I didn't like this service, the last thing that you want to do is talk to them more. But if you ask them questions, particularly open questions are like, can you tell me more about, or can you give me some more context as to this? That is going to allow the other person to share what they want to share, get it off their chest, so then you can address it rather than shutting them off with closed questions. Closed questions are like yes or no. So you're saying that you had a bad service. Yes or no. you're cutting someone off, and what's happening is it's just extending the process. So when I do trainings like this with businesses, we play the questions game. And so how the questions game works is it's just 20 questions. You get to ask questions and get responses from other people, particularly to guess a person. In the first round, we play yes or no only. You have to ask yes or no questions. That's like, is the person alive? Yes or no. Where in the second round, you can ask open-ended questions like, is the person alive or dead? You know, they can give you more expanse, which one it is. You could also say, do they play a sport? And instead of the other person saying yes or no, they can say, yes, they play soccer for X team. Ultimately, it takes less questions to get to the person, and it takes less time to do it. So in the first round where it's yes and no, it's awkward because it's kind of a stunted conversation. You're just doing yes and no, which a lot of people fall back on when it's a difficult conversation. And ultimately, across all of the groups I've done with this, most people don't even get to an answer by 20 questions. And it takes them on average, even though I tell them they have 4 minutes, on average between 6 and 8 minutes to get there. When you have open-ended questions, they tend to find an answer and they do it in like 2.5 minutes. So it shortens your conversation and it limits the amount of conversation you have to have. Most people think if they make their questions short and to the point, it will make it so that the other person can end the conversation faster. In reality, if you use open questions, the other person feels free to share, and that then allows you to gain the information you need to move the conversation forward faster rather than slower. Let's see if we have a question. Question. So one of the conversations I had difficult as a new business owner is asking customers to leave reviews, especially if I know the customer on a more personal level. How could I create an environment that supports my goal of getting them to leave a review online? It's a great question, Rachel. So first thing is, one, being confident in asking for that review. When we come in, again, nervous energy, well, I'd really kind of like, it would be great if you could leave this review. It automatically kind of makes other people nervous because you're nervous. So coming into a confident saying, hi, I know that it seemed like you had a great experience. I was hoping that you could leave a review so that other people can have that same experience. So coming in with it confidently. Another great way of doing it is asking for feedback when you do it. So when you just ask for something, a lot of people are like, oh yeah, I'll kind of throw it on the back burner. But if you ask for genuine feedback of what you want from that other person. Hey, I want to provide the best service for my clients as possible. I want to hear from you about what I can do. What you're doing is you're making the other person feel heard and they want to provide feedback. So what I do in my business, for example, and my business is a little tough because outside of the law school, I do divorce and family law. So a lot of people, when they're done, they're done. Like they don't want to talk anymore. They don't want to talk to you anymore. You do it and they leave. But I just provide a survey in my final email. I say, thank you. I let them know I really appreciate all the hard work that they did. And I give them a survey. And I say very humbly, I want to provide the best service possible. And you just went through the service. So I'd love to hear from you. And so they get survey questions and they can fill it out. And then at the end, they write a review. And then what happens is if they leave a negative review, I follow up with them and say, because the review is just to me, right? It also avoids you having reviews that go out that you don't want out there. You can reach out and say, thank you so much for providing that review. I saw that you had these concerns. I'd love to talk to you about them. But if it's a positive review, then I have an automated email that I send out that says, thank you so much for your positive review. We really appreciate that you had this great experience. If you would, it would be great if you could just copy and paste the review that you already gave me and put it online so that other people can get the same great experience that you did. So again, coming into it with confidence that that's what you want, but also getting something with what they're giving. So they're giving something. They're getting something in return by being heard. They get to be heard about what the experience is like. Some people also do like thank you. So I've had companies that have sent out like little Starbucks gift cards, like thank you so much for your review. But ideally, you don't want to be like, if you leave a review, you get a $5 Starbucks gift card. Instead, you want it to be something natural But if you genuinely ask people what their experience was like, they're really excited to tell you, because lots of people like to just share their opinion and they want to share their opinion. So a lot of times it's let them share their opinion, then ultimately ask for a review afterwards. They've also then built up all that information based on the questions you've asked. So your review is likely to be better because you prompted them with review questions first. So then they can talk about it like, oh, I really like this and this and this, but you already prompted them with a question regarding that. So that can be super helpful. Another question, what are some nonverbal traits in the virtual world? Are there unique traits brought about by the virtual format? Great question. So having a difficult conversation online is what I think you're referring to, can definitely be challenging, particularly if people don't know how to use technology. I always say when you're having a difficult conversation, you want face-to-face. That can be via Zoom, that could be face-to-face in person. Ideally, you don't want to have difficult conversations via email or phone. The reason for that is you can't see the other person's nonverbal cues. So that's the biggest limit with virtual, is when you're in a virtual world, what's happening is you're losing those cues. You're also losing the cues in like an email or a text. I always say, do not have a conversation that's difficult via text or email. Everyone will misinterpret your tone. They'll misinterpret what you intend. There is a really great book out that's by Bill Eddy. It's called BIFF, BIFF. It's how you actually handle difficult things via email or writing. It's a brief, informative, friendly, firm. So if you do have a business where you don't really have a lot of connection, where you're actually getting to see people, strongly recommend that book, because it's going to go through exactly how you handle conversations that are difficult or challenging or high conflict via email. So ideally you get on Zoom. Some things to be aware of. People are not super tech savvy. So you want to be aware that you might need to help them walk through getting on Zoom or having that conversation. Also helping them with their video. I love the people that have video, but like they're on top of the camera, so you can't see them, or they have something in the way of the camera. Or my favorite are the people that like essentially have the camera like looking straight up their nose. Like what are you doing with that? So making sure that people are actually in your view, just like I am here in Zoom, so you can actually see them. Other things that you can look for in nonverbal that are going to be unique online. More people are going to be, which you probably see this in reviews like on Yelp, more people are going to be much more willing to share how they feel virtually than they are in person. That's because they feel like they have this barrier of protection in terms of the screen. And so that's why you get people who like troll online, because they leave bad reviews because they don't really care. No one knows, it's not affecting anybody. So they don't really get to see it. That's why also virtual in terms of Zoom can be better, because they can see your reaction that they are causing and vice versa. But just be aware that you are going to have people who are higher conflict, who are going to be harder to have conversations with online than in person, because they have that screen in between them. So they're going to feel like they have a virtual barrier. So hopefully that's helpful. Let's see here. So other things to look at: silence. Feel free to add more questions if you have them in the Q&A. Silence. So giving people the space to talk. We tend to hate silence. It makes us very uncomfortable. I do another thing with the businesses that I work with where we have conversations and one person has to be silent, and it kills them. It is 2 minutes and you would have thought it was 2 hours, because we're not used to silence. But leaving that space, particularly when someone is having a hard time with a conversation, they might just need space. So don't feel like you have to fill it every single second. A lot of people, they just get really nervous and they talk and they talk and they talk, but the other person doesn't have an opportunity to add anything because they're just trying to process. So being aware of silence. This is particularly important if you work with anyone who potentially has any learning disabilities. A lot of times it takes them longer to process what you're saying and to interpret it and understand it. So if you have somebody who is struggling to participate in a group or participate in conversations, It might be just because they don't have the ability or context to do so because everyone's tripping over each other to talk and they don't have the opportunity to add anything. Also, I'll say encouraging the other person to continue speaking. Again, we're afraid of that. We don't want the difficult conversation to last longer. Again, the quicker we invite people in, the shorter your conversation will be. It just doesn't feel natural to do that, but that's how it works. And prompting them to move forward. So can you give me a little bit more information? Okay, so I'm hearing this. How does that apply here? It's really going to help you understand what the other person's context is. It's also going to help you be more empathetic to an individual who you're sharing difficult conversations with. A great question. So what about an autistic business owner, or if you're a business owner and you have a learning disability or something that just makes it harder for you to work on an everyday basis? A great example of this is if you have dyslexia and you're trying to work through answering difficult emails and conversations that way, can be very challenging. I always say know yourself and ask for more space. So a lot of people hate to inconvenience others. And so what happens is they just fall into this normal, I have to deal with other people's way of conversing. Instead, if you're planning the conversation, you can plan it accordingly. So you can plan out the conversation ahead of time. So again, you know what the topics are, but you also can plan out anticipating, hey, let's take breaks. So you can build in breaks into conversations. People feel like they can't do that. I do it all the time. Let's take a break. And now that we talked about stuff, I want us to take a break, step back. We'll both think about what we said, and then we'll jump back in. You get to control the conversation that you have. So you can go through and say, this is the structure that's going to work for the best for the way my brain works. You know how your brain works. You know what's going to work best for you. So understanding that and building it into the conversation. If someone else brings you a conversation and is not respecting the way that you would have a conversation, just letting them know, hey, I need a little bit more time to work through this issue. Let's take a break. Let's come back in 4 minutes. You're allowed to establish your own boundaries in that conversation as well if you are not the one that's brought the issue, so that you can be as successful in the conversation as possible. It's just, you don't need to dive into that you have autism or that you have dyslexia or that you're having any other challenge with the conversation. It's just saying, I need a minute or I need X, and establishing that boundary while you're in the conversation so that it can be more successful. The goal overall is that you can plan for the conversation. So if you can prepare for it, that's the easiest option. So there's this lovely thing, you can find it online, a researcher put together called Candid. Candid is how you have a difficult conversation. And I love having this when I'm preparing for a difficult conversation just in front of me. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to compartmentalize. So again, this is, what is your agenda? So dividing the conversation into parts. What are things that are going to be easy to discuss because they're more logical and they're not emotionally charged? What are more emotionally charged things? So for instance, there could be a conversation where you fire someone and they totally expect it because they weren't doing the job they were supposed to be doing, and they just kind of were flying under the radar and they knew maybe you'd catch it at some point. Maybe that's not an emotional conversation, where if you fire someone that you've had at your company for 20 years, that's emotional. So what are the pieces that you can have as a part that's logical and then a part that's feeling based? Ask. So as we've been talking about this entire time, we want to acknowledge the other person's response and be curious, not furious. I love that framing of curious, not furious. We tend to get defensive. It's natural. We get defensive because let's say that we bring something to someone and they're like, no, this is your fault, or no, this is someone else's fault. When you know it's not, you tend to become defensive about that. So being curious, ask why, not automatically defend. So let's say someone says, well, actually, it's not that I'm not doing a good job. It's that Susan's not doing a good job. Okay, so if we know that Susan's doing a great job, our natural instinct could be to be furious. Actually, Susan's great at her job, and you don't know what you're talking about. That's not going to get us anywhere. So instead, be curious. Why do you feel that way? Normalize what has happened to you or others has happened before. Everyone wants to feel normal. Everyone wants to feel liked. So this is normal. It's a normal thing to have a performance review. It's a normal thing to have a performance plan. It's not just you. It's a normal thing that we implement to be able to make everybody better at their job. Discuss, understand, again, the facts versus the emotions, those parts of the what conversation, emotion conversation, and be empathetic. I always define this. Sympathy is I feel bad for you. Empathy is I feel what you're feeling and I can understand where you're coming from. You don't have to agree with somebody to be empathetic for what they're experiencing. Incentivize. So what is the benefit for the change when there's a difficult conversation? What is the benefit of having a performance plan? What is the benefit of moving someone to a different department? What are those things that are going to provide confidence in the other person and that this is the right decision? And ultimately end the conversation with positivity and it as normal as possible. You don't want it to then be super awkward where the other person can't have a conversation with you moving forward, or it doesn't feel comfortable coming to you with an issue moving forward. We want to make sure that we have the conversation, we cut it off. The conversation's done. This is the next step. We go back to being positive and normal, not some awkward feelings. Let's see. Can you even let them know when you're not prepared for the conversation, schedule a time in the future is the question. Absolutely. So you can have someone bring a conversation forward and say, I didn't know this was a problem. I'm really sorry to hear that. I want to schedule a time for us to sit down. That's also that like finding the right time and place. So let's say that someone comes to you like an employee and says, well, this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong. And you're in the middle of doing all this stuff. You're not going to be able to focus on that conversation. So letting them know, I understand this is important to you. These are the issues you want to talk about. Let's set an actual time and sit down and pick that time. That way the person feels acknowledged and heard, and you set out a time when you can have a more successful conversation about it, rather than trying to grapple with the conversation right there because you feel like you have to have it. You don't have to have the conversation right then. You can actually have it when it makes more sense for you to be engaged in the conversation. Last little bit, because we've had great questions and we're running out of time. Don'ts of difficult conversations. You don't have to agree to understand. You can be understanding of the other person without agreeing with them. You can understand that they're frustrated without agreeing that their frustration is valid. That's totally okay. So again, separating your feelings from someone else. Don't leave the bad news until the end. You don't do the good news first and bad news last. Again, we want to end with positivity and normalcy. So start with the bad news, get to the good news. Don't place blame or be defensive on the other person. We want to focus on the future. We've talked about that quite a bit. And you want to come into a conversation with a positive mindset, not a negative mindset. So being aware, again, of how you're putting off. If you come off with this negative, nervous, unconfident energy, the other person is going to feel that and they're going to bring it back to you. So making sure that you're there as well. You'll get the slides at the end if you would like to review as well. I know they'll be posted with the video, but I do want to just put up my information. If you have any other questions, please feel free to ask and reach out via email. We also put all of our trainings on our website. So we have tons of trainings that are open to the public, and we're always here as a resource if you need any help having difficult conversations.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristen. That was a great presentation. And just as Kristen said, the slide deck will be available with the recording later today or tomorrow. So you can download that. A lot of great stuff to go back and check out. I definitely got a few tips out of it that I needed to work on implementing in my approaches. So thank you. With that, we're right at time. So we will go ahead and wrap up. So remind everybody, please join us next Tuesday, 9 a.m. for our next webinar. But until then, everybody have a great week, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you all for having me. Have a wonderful rest of your day.